One very common argument against the existence of God is known as the problem of evil. Now, broadly speaking, this argument goes something like this. If God exists, there would be no evil in the world. There is evil in the world, therefore God does not exist. Now, this type of argument was the one invoked by Stephen Fry in the now infamous interview with the late Irish broadcaster Gay Byrne. When asked what he would say to God if he exists, Fry launches a tirade. He said, "Bone cancer in children, what's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is so much misery and it is not our fault? It's not right, it's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect such a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world in which is so full of pain and injustice?" Now, admittedly, this kind of argument has an emotional attachment, right? We have all felt the sting of evil at some point in our lives. But the question is, does this argument hold up logically? And the thing that I want to focus on in this video is the fact that that argument hinges on the concept of evil or suffering, but without defining it. And this begs the question, how do we actually define evil or suffering? Is it even possible to define evil or suffering in the atheistic worldview, or must we borrow the concept from an absolute God? In the same way that we understand darkness as absence of light, we can only really understand evil in relation to its counterpoint, good. It is meaningless to discuss evil without a moral arbiter to distinguish it from good. So in other words, in order to talk about evil or suffering, we really need to discuss the concept of morality. Now, most people, regardless of their worldview, at least agree that there is a perceived moral order at work, even if that moral order varies across society and era. Now, of course, in the atheistic worldview, the origin of that moral order is not absolute or objective. Instead, one has to invoke some kind of pragmatic evolutionary argument. For example, one says something to the effect that what we perceive as moral order or ethics is nothing but a social construct that exists because societies that adhered to a common set of behavioral rules were more likely to survive. But of course, what that particular moral framework looks like is otherwise arbitrary. It's simply a hangover from the survival of the fittest. And no society is any more or any less moral than any other in this framework. Hitler's morality is no better or no worse than any other society. In fact, had Hitler succeeded in conquering Europe, we might have a completely new moral order that would be perfectly acceptable to the moral relativist. What if, for example, society evolved in such a way that torturing children for entertainment was socially acceptable? Now, this might seem far-fetched, but it's not. Thousands of years ago, there were societies for which sacrificing children was a common and socially acceptable religious activity. It was part of the social construct. And to the moral relativist, the social construct is what morality is. So the society which sacrifices children is no more or no less moral than any society we have today. A fact I think most would find completely unpalatable and unreasonable. Even the great philosopher, mathematician, and atheist Bertrand Russell concedes that science alone cannot supply us with an ethic. The point is that the problem of evil argument requires an absolute notion of evil to make sense. And in the atheistic worldview, there is no firm basis to judge what is evil or suffering. How can Stephen Fry complain that God is evil while at the same time deny an absolute standard or reference point for judging what is evil in the first place? If all there is nature, then bone cancer in children is not evil. It is just nature acting in accordance with her laws. Sickness leading to death is natural in this sense, but intrinsically we recognize the deepest cruelty in a child that suffers bone cancer. We know that even though the laws of nature are at work in the usual way, there is a very real injustice at play. But only the believer in an absolute moral standard has the luxury of this perspective. Ultimately, this problem of evil argument has snuck in the back door an absolute moral standard from an absolute God in order to argue that God doesn't exist. This, in my view, is a logical contradiction. Besides the logical error, even those who claim that morality is relative behave like it is absolute when they perceive an injustice against them. When we perceive an injustice against us, we all appeal to a commonly understood moral standard. Nobody accused of murder, for example, protests on the basis that all they've done is violate an arbitrary standard. Surely such a person would have a pathological disorder. More than that, if morality is simply just a social construct, then what we perceive as a conscience is nothing but a psychology rooted in the fear of social punishment. But there are many commonly accepted trespasses that have no obvious social punishment. In fact, quite the opposite can be true. Society can greatly reward deception, for example. Then there are more latent issues like jealousy or wishing ill of a friend. Surely there can be no social punishment for things that don't even have an external or behavioral expression. And then there's a complex spectrum of everything in between. For example, what are we to make of the person who commits adultery? That might necessarily have a social punishment. For example, their spouse may never even find out. But surely the conscience testifies that there is genuine guilt, not just psychological guilt that's rooted in the fear of punishment. The conscience itself testifies that there has been a genuine betrayal. After all, we all expect our spouse to honor the vow that they gave us, and we would be morally indignant, more than that, rightfully furious if they didn't. We are appealing in this instance to a moral standard. But if there's no reference point for that moral standard, then a cheating spouse is not really committing a moral wrong. They are merely breaking a standard of etiquette. Does anyone truly believe that adultery is only wrong in the same sense as bad manners? Now, apart from the issue of defining evil in this problem of evil argument, I also believe that the claim that God does nothing about the evil and suffering in the world is also false. Now, I can appreciate that this can be a sensitive topic, particularly to the one who maybe has felt a sense of abandonment during their time of need or their time of suffering. It's not too difficult to believe how people come to the conclusion that there isn't a good God, since if there was, they feel that he would have come to help them in their time of need. And while I don't want to really spend time in this video addressing that more personal and existential issue, I do want to say that it's a central tenet of Christianity that God became flesh in the person of Jesus in order to identify with our sufferings. More than that, he cared enough to provide healing for our sufferings through his death on the cross. So God does care. He does see your need, and he has acted on your behalf. And the cross on which the historical person of Jesus died, is God's solution to the problem of evil. And indeed, it's a picture of God's perfect morality to lay down your life for another. There is, of course, still evil and suffering in the world, but the bigger picture here is that love requires free will. And that means the freedom for the individual and for societies to choose evil as well as good. But the point of this video is that what we call evil or good is a matter of taste without an absolute reference point for morality. And who could imagine the depths of depravity that society could slump to if we lived in the conviction of this belief that what we call good and evil is a matter of taste. But no, instead, I thank God that we have a conscience that bears witness to an absolute standard of morality, albeit a faint and cracked reflection of God's perfect morality.